So why should you care about synthesis? Honestly, everything's kind of a synthesizer if you squint hard enough. Synths changed the musical landscape in more ways than one. For one thing, basically any track you hear has a synth on it in some way, shape, or form.
I feel like a kid in a candy shop, like, whoa.
In addition to that, synths have actually added a lot of musical complexity to the musical landscape that wouldn't have existed otherwise by breaking us out of this traditional Western form of music. Like how the first synths were essentially invented to emulate a lot of other things, most music that we listen to in the digital landscape is emulations of old analog gear. Arguably, the very first synth, the telharmonium, was designed to emulate old acoustic instruments like cellos and flutes and violins. Synthesis is amazing because if you know what you're doing, you can essentially emulate any sound out there to some degree, or you can make your own sound that you've literally never heard before.
I am making a dragon sound.
We are going to learn the history of the synthesizer up to a certain degree, and we are also going to learn the basics of how synthesis works so you can start to learn how to write on a synthesizer, both digitally and on an analog synth. So the origin date of the synthesizer is kind of hard to determine. If you're going to go by literally the first instrument that was called a synthesizer, it's 1956. That synthesizer was called the RCA Electronic Synthesizer Mark I, but honestly, the more famous one is the Mark II.
This is music with a strictly electronic beat.
It incorporated what could be considered the first sequencer for a synthesizer ever, and it did so using paper. Literally a piece of paper with holes punched in it. The holes meant play a note or not play a note. It was a form of binary songwriting. More on this in a little bit, but first, there are a lot of machines out there that predate this RCA synthesizer that use a lot of the same technology in a more mechanical fashion. What you just saw was the orchestrion. It was essentially an entire quartet in a cabinet. It essentially used the same roll of paper that the RCA synthesizer did, but it used it 200 years ago. It was the exact same concept. Whenever there was a hole punched in the grid, then the machine knew to press down on the instrument and actually play the violin or play the piano. In this way, we are seeing music being created using binary coding clear back before there was even a means to make an electronic signal that produced a noise. Now, maybe that's cool, but it's not creepy enough for you. I got you. What you just saw was the automaton of Queen Marie Antoinette of France. It was actually a gift to King Louis of France, and it's terrifying. The automaton worked in a very similar method that the orchestrion did. The only difference is where the orchestrion used binary digits basically printed onto paper, the automaton literally had those binary things printed onto a cylinder, and that would literally physically move the arms and the legs of the automaton to play the dulcimer. It was essentially a very early form of robotics and a very early form of synthesis, or the automation of sound. So those things are cool, and those things are really awesome to look at and to discover the history of automation with music, but they aren't necessarily synthesizers. In order to actually be synthesis, we need to electronically produce a sound. That would not happen until the late 1800s with the telharmonium. Now, if you're familiar with this channel, there was a video on the telharmonium that you can watch later, so I'm not going to go too much into detail on this amazing machinery. I highly recommend you go check that video out. But essentially how it worked is the telharmonium used magnets and a giant gear, and the gear would move next to the magnets, and it would actually produce a sine wave in that method. I don't know how. It's kind of magic to me. But I know there was a ton of gears, and it was so big, it was larger than most buildings at the time. And the reason was they didn't have amplification back then. There was no way to take an electric signal that was really small and then make it bigger. The only solution was to make as big of an electronic signal as possible and then shoot that out into the world. No amplifications, big old noises. It just had to start as a big old noise. Now, it would be wrong of me to go through this whole thing without mentioning Don Buchla and Bob Moog, or the founders of modern synthesis. Don Buchla is from the West Coast style of synthesis, or additive synthesis, and Bob Moog is subtractive synthesis, or East Coast synthesis. What we're going to go through today, a little later on in the video, is subtractive synthesis. This is a really easy way to kind of ease our way into what synthesis is. And it will be a really great starting point for people that don't quite understand the mystique of the whole synthesizer. Subtractive synthesis, or the Moog, the Bob Moog style of synthesis, works by essentially taking a signal and then chopping away at it until you're left with something that seemed pure at one point, and then we crafted it into something our own. And we typically do this through filters and envelopes, as well as LFOs. The other side of that, the Western side of synthesis, works in more nefarious, secret ways. Essentially, additive synthesis is exactly as the name implies. We are going to take multiple sound waves and then layer them on top of each other until we're left with a more unique conglomerate of all these different sound profiles. Don Buchla's synths were also really well known for using interesting creative ways for controlling the sound, whereas Bob Moog typically had a keyboard or something that resembled a piano. Don Buchla tended to use touch sensors, or even no controller at all, completely relying on the use of knobs and signal flow in order to control what you heard out of the synthesizer. Additive synthesis also led to more complex forms of synthesis later on, like FM synthesis or frequency modulation synthesis, and I cannot even begin to describe that. I barely understand it myself. I'm just starting in that realm. Okay, fast forward. We are now in the 80s, and if anyone knows anything about the 80s, that was the decade of the synth.
Introducing the world's most advanced rhythm machine, the Roland TR-808.
In some ways. In fact, I would venture to say when most people think of synthesizers, they think of a black Yamaha DX7 from the 80s with a bunch of really cool presets on it. This is because in addition to the 80s being the decade of the synths, it's sort of the decade of the presets.
Oh no!
Whereas older synthesizers tended to really rely on the user to understand how to manufacture sound all the way back from the oscillator, 80s synthesizers tend to have a press and go sort of mentality. In a lot of ways, this led to a wider acceptance of the synthesizer in contemporary culture, which is one of the reasons we see synthwave and all these different genres coming out of the 80s flourishing. The 80s also gave rise to the drum synthesizer, specifically things like the TR-808, the 909, the CR-78, basically anything Roland made with drums, they were legendary. Drum machines really defined the sound of pop music during the time, and especially with hip hop. Early 80s and 90s hip hop used the 808 in order to create a signature sound that is still emulated so much today. Even more recently, we are seeing the rise of boutique modular gear and synthesis becoming more and more widely known and widely accepted to greater markets. A modular synthesizer is exactly as the name implies. It is one module of the greater scheme of what compromises a synthesizer. You might have an oscillator from one company, and in the same exact synth, you might order a envelope or a filter from another. It's like taking different ingredients from a pizza and putting it together. Maybe you have the... No, I'm not going to do that. Of course, we cannot forget the all-important realm of the digital synthesizer. Plugins like Massive and FM8, Serum, and more recently Vital are probably about 75% of the synth sounds that you like, whether you like that concept or not. Digital synthesis is kind of the way of the future, and it's the way that modern music has been crafted for the last 10 years. Okay, so clearly I rushed through a little bit of the second half of the history of synthesis, but that's because I want to get to how we can begin to understand synthesizers. So we're going to learn how exactly to make synthesis using both analog and digital means. In order to do that, we're going to be using this synth and this synth. This one's digital. So I'm going to add it in post. So let's get started. In the next video, because let's be honest, neither of us want a 20-minute long video. We're going to talk about actually creating sounds with synthesis, and we're going to do exactly that. Tune in next week if you want to see it, or if it is the future, go watch it now. Hope it's good, because I've not made it yet. Oh yeah, and you can subscribe if you want.